Antony Catella. Please tell us all about dynamic formatting for Power BI.
Right, so first of all, let me share my screen. Just want to make sure, can people see my screen? Sue,
Yes,
can you see that?
I can
hope
see
everybody else can in the chat as well. If not, then please let me know. So we're going to be looking at dynamic formatting using dynamic format strings and conditional formatting. Now, the picture on the title page has got relevance to this topic. It's a chameleon that is found in South Africa. They found in Africa and Asia. And this particular one is a flap-necked chameleon found in the Kruger National Park in South Africa. Now, about myself, let me just jump onto the next page, so I work for a consultancy here in the UK. I work primarily with non-profits. So the data set that I've actually got here is actually data that I've taken a sample set of data, which is actually looking at donors who've actually donated income to a fictitious charity. So this is why it's not of your sort of Contosa sales database, whatever. It's actually, this is data that's actually more related to charity data. And so part of the thing is that I love the natural world. I'm very passionate about wildlife, really enjoy mountain biking, and I tend to do baking in my spare time as well. What I will be doing is, if you want to connect, then go onto LinkedIn here. I will be posting the PBEX onto my GitHub later on. So this will be the link that it's found in, and it'll be under the Devon and Cornwall Meetup group folder. So I'll put it in there later tonight or tomorrow morning. So let's get on to the introduction side. So people may be asking, well, so the top here, we've got flap-necked chameleons, and the bottom one, we've got a virtual zebra. Now, people may say, what on earth has a chameleon and a zebra got to do with dynamic formatting? Well, chameleons have got this amazing capability to be able to change their color and or pattern depending on where they are within the environment. And so you can actually pick up a chameleon and you can actually, they might be a certain color and you move them to a different location and they'll actually start changing color to match their surroundings. So as I said earlier, on the title page, there was a picture of a green and black chameleon. The top one here is a pure green chameleon, and we've got a brown chameleon. All three of them are the identical species and are all found in the same national park in South Africa. So they've got this capability to be able to change color depending on where they are. Whereas your zebra, black and white or white and black, whichever one you want to call it, they don't have this ability to change color. They're the same color, doesn't matter where they are. So how does this relate to Power BI? Well, if we think about it as Power BI developers, whenever we build a report, we fix the format of the values and the labels. We, be that with whole numbers, no decimals, currency. We set the data labels to be on. We set the colors of various columns. Whereas, so that's sort of, you think about that from a, pertaining to a zebra cannot change its stripes. Whereas, what about if we could do like a chameleon does? Why can't we give the option to users to give them the ability to change the formatting of visuals on the fly? So what are we trying to aim for? So this is the target page that we are trying to get to. So this page is what we'll work through all the different building blocks, working through this one. So on this particular page, I can change the label and column formatting. So what if I wanted to highlight the highest and lowest income columns within this actual chart? What happens if I say wanted to show the actual display label? So I'll actually show the actual income itself. It might be that I actually want to change the display. So these are in whole numbers at the moment. What happens if I say want to change it to just display it in millions instead, or even show it as millions with one decimal place? I want to give that option. What if I wanted to actually add an average line to the visual itself? So all these sort of different things play into this particular page itself, is that sort of flexibility of giving the user the option how they actually want to highlight particular points of interest for themselves on a page itself. So let's start off with looking at dynamic format strings. Now, dynamic format strings, they had this capability within calculation groups. So the idea behind it is that you can apply these format strings to measures without forcing measures to be returned as strings, because if you use the format DAX function, that'll actually change your measure to be actually text and not a number itself. So it looks like it's a number, but in actual fact, it changes its data type to be text. So when you try and put it in a chart, it won't actually display in the chart. When you put it on a table, for example, you can't actually put data bars because there's actually no number for it to be able to work with. The one thing with calculation groups, they're normally applied to all the measures on a page or visual. Yes, you can add other exceptions, but that's other new level of complexity to them. Now, dynamic format strings for measures came out in April 2023. So you can apply a format string to an individual measure. Now, to get the setting to be turned on is you need to go through the file, options and settings, into options under preview features. There's an option for dynamic format strings for measures. So if you go in there, check that on, and then you'll get an option to actually create dynamic format strings within measures. Now, one of the things that to remember as well is that within dynamic format strings for measures, you can actually reference the measure itself within the dynamic format string. You can actually make quite complex strings within the format strings, or you can actually use selected measure within those format strings. But we'll get onto all the different variations later on. Any questions, Sue, so far?
No questions so far.
Right. So how do we get these to actually work? So if I look at the first instance here, so I've got a couple of measures here. One of the measures that I'm going to be looking at, first of all, is one that is actually called this particular one, which is a very simple measure that's just looking at the change in total income from 1 year to the previous year. And what I've done here is that I've actually formatted it. So at the top here is that it's got a standard format there of currency with 2 decimal places. So in the bottom table here is that using this, it's going to be formatted as a currency with 2 decimal places. And the standard sort of formatting within Power BI for currency using that will actually put brackets around any negative number. Now, the option is that you may want to change this and actually select the dynamic option. So if I go to the top here under currency, there's an option down at the bottom called dynamic. So if you select dynamic on a measure itself, what will happen is initially the original format string will actually appear. I hope people can see that. So the initial format string that was previously applied to the measure will be automatically populated. You can now go in as a user and go and modify that to whatever you would actually like to make it. So in this instance is that I'm going to leave this one currently at the moment. I'm going to get out of this particular measure. But what I am going to do is go into the actual dynamic measure that I created, which is created. So what happens is once you create a dynamic format string, on the left-hand side here, you'll get another drop-down option. So you'll get your measure here, but you'll also have an option for format. If you select format, this will then show you the format string that the dynamic format string that you're actually applying to that measure. In this instance, I've made a very simple option here, but what I've done is that instead of having the brackets for my negative numbers, I've put in a minus here. So when I look at the table down below here, is that my dynamic numbers are all actually got a minus against them instead of having a brackets against them, which is what the default currency would actually be using. So that's the sort of really basic premise behind actually setting them up. Now, next stage that I actually wanted to run through is to go through and just cover off some sort of building blocks for people, because it took me a while to get my head around these sort of things. So a numeric format string has actually got 1 to 3 sections separated by a semicolon. Now, so what happens is that the first section, if you only include one section in your format string, then that'll be applied to all values. So positive numbers, negative numbers, and your 0 will be formatted if there's only one section within your format string. If you include 2 sections within your format string, the first section will be used for positive numbers and zeros, and your second section will be used for negative values. If you include all 3 sections, positive for your first section, negative for your second section, and 0 for your third section. So you may, for instance, you may want to leave this as a 0. You may want to, change it depending on what you're actually wanting to do, depending on your values that you've got. Now, one of the important things to also think about is...
Sorry, Antony, I missed the last one, the last bit. The first 2 I've got. What was the meaning of the last one?
The last one, the third section, is if you have all 3 sections, the third one is if there's a 0 in the value.
Ah, I didn't know that. I often wondered that. Thank you.
So the third one is 0. So if you, for example, wanted to put a dash, or you wanted to format that as to say something, some other variation, you can use that third section within your format string.
Brilliant. Thank you.
So what I've got here is a table to explain some of the different variations that you can actually use. So there's different characters that you can use. So first one is a 0. Now, if you put a 0 in your format string, it'll display a digit or a 0, even if the number has fewer digits than the format string. So, for example, in this situation here is that if I've got 0.0, it's going to show, and I've got a value of 0.12, it's only going to show 0.1. That's what it's going to do. If you put a hash in your format string, that'll display a digit or nothing. So it depends on how many numbers you've got within your format, within your value. But what will happen is you won't get any leading or trailing zeros displayed. So, for example, you may get a situation is that if I ended up putting in a number here that was 00.00, and you had a value, an unformatted value of 0.12, you'll end up with a situation here where you'll end up with 00.1. So your zeros will stay within your number. And so that's why I tend to use the hash symbol more, so you don't end up with unnecessary zeros being added in. Now, the example up top here, this first line here, is a hash dot hash hash. Now, the dot indicates your decimal placeholder. Now, what happens is there are, which we'll get onto later, hopefully if time allows, there are situations in countries that don't necessarily use a dot as the decimal separator. There are countries around the world that will actually use a comma as a decimal separator. But within the format strings is that if you use a dot, it recognizes it as the decimal placeholder. And so in this situation here is that I've got a 0.12. What happens is that that'll then format that as .12 because there's a hash in front of the dot. It's not actually going to put a 0 in the front of it. It drops it. So you end up with this situation. The next situation, third one down, is where you've got 0.hash hash. Now, if you've got an unformatted value of 0.50, it'll format that as 0.5 because it's going to get rid of that extra 0 because it's a 0. If that was 0.51, it'll add the 1 at the end because it looks at the 1 and it'll actually put the 1 in place. In this situation here is that I've got 0.00, unformatted value of 0.50. I get 0.50 because I'm using the zeros here and not the hash symbols. Then your percentage placeholder is to convert a number to percentages. So in this situation, I've got 0.50. That'll then change that to 50.0% because I've got the dot zero. So I've got a single zero to the right of the decimal placeholder. It's only going to do one decimal place for me, even though there's another zero here, but I've actually asked it to only give me one decimal place. Then you've got the situation where you've got the comma, which used as a 1,000 separator. So in this situation, I've got hash dot hash 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 dot 0. If I've now got a unformatted value of 123.00, that's going to get formatted as 1,234.0 with one decimal place because I've only got the single zero. The last option further down here is that if you're wanting to include other sort of letters and characters, so for example, I've got a K here to indicate thousands, but the key thing here is that if you look closely, I've got a comma here before the dot. So if there are any commas just before the decimal separator, then the number will get divided by the number of commas, and each comma represents 1,000. So if there's one comma, it'll divide the number by 1,000. If there's two commas, it divides it by 1,000,000. If there's three commas, it'll divide it by 1,000,000,000. So in this situation here is that I've got a single comma just before the dot. I've got this particular number, so it'll then format that as 1,234K because I've got no zero after the dot, so I won't end up with any decimal points. Whereas in this situation, the bottom one, I've got three commas before the decimal point, plus a zero after the decimal place. So I'm going to end up with a value of 123.5 billion on the back end. Now, the other thing as well that you can also do, you can also add other certain characters within your format strings. So I could add other letters, I could add text within a format string, I could add currency symbols, things like that. The one thing that you do have to be very, very careful about is when you're adding in other sort of strings, if you add these particular reserved characters, such as a zero, a hash, a percent, a comma, period, within your text, the other text sort of part of it, you need to make sure that that text has got double quotes around it. Else what happens is that Power BI will try and format that number because it thinks that it sees a dot and goes, oh, so that's a decimal separator in there, or it sees a zero or something like that. Or so you've got to be very, very careful when you are adding in these particular reserved characters in your format strings. So that's a basic idea behind all the different format strings. Any questions, Sue?
Yeah, so UV said, is there a website that gives the format expression when we input both unformatted value and formatted value? Something like columns from examples. I was trying to think.
I haven't found one. But there is the you might be able to do that. I can't remember where it does it. Later on, there's a link that I've got to the format DAX function that actually lists out all the different characters, be they the number characters, the date characters, the time characters that you can use in format strings. I can't remember whether there was a sort of sandbox in that page.
Yeah. Okay. I like the .NET ones where you just put in currency 0 and it does it for you. I think that's quite cool. Christian said, when in DAX editor, use Control plus mouse, and that'll help to increase your font size without having to use Zoom it.
Control plus.
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
Control
Thank
plus.
You. Thank you.
And Fernando said, do you prefer formatting like hashtag, comma, hashtag 0 with the two commas, or dividing the measure by 1,000,000? And I said one's formatting and the other's changing the results, but then I didn't know you could do two commas to get the K.
Yeah, you can.
But that's still formatting, whereas dividing.
it's a formatting. It depends on if you want to use it somewhere else side of things.
Yeah.
If you're wanting to have a separate one, I'll show some examples. That's sort of coming up later on with the visual level ones. But there are things that you relates to that, Fernando. You have there are some cautionary tales that I've discovered along the way, where I found dividing it by million tends to be safer than trying to use the comma in the formatting side of things.
Okay, fine. We'll let you carry on.
Well, right. So first of all, what I'm wanting to look at now is let's go through some variations as to, well, how do you actually do some of these, do some of the sort of dynamic formatting? How do I actually, implement it in a report? So there are a couple of, what I wanted to do was to start looking at a sort of option of where you use the actual custom format strings that you've imported in a table, or you've entered them in a calculated table. Or the other option is where earlier is that you actually do it within the measure itself. So what I've got here is that this first column here is what I call, it's just called display units. So if I show people the very briefly what the structure of the table is. So this one here is that all this is that this is just I've got a column here just to show me what the actual what I'm wanting to use in the slicer, and then I've actually got the format string built in here within the actual display format. So I've got a column here, and this will actually show me all the different format strings that I'm wanting to assign to the number depending on what I'm actually selecting in the slicer. So if I go back to the actual page itself, is that in this table on the right hand side here is that currently I've got millions selected in the table. The display format is going to be changed to millions. Now this first column here is my original measure that I used, which is just total income USD, because all the data in the table, in the data table, is all in USD. And I've just set this measure up here. So this measure here is just set up to have a sort of what I would call the sort of standard currency with 2 decimal places. There's no changes going on at all with that measure. Whereas I've now got another measure in here which is a table-based one. Now, if we go look at the table-based measure, is that is referencing the original total income USD measure, but I've changed the formatting to dynamic here. And what the format string does here, it's looking at the selected value for the Christy, you're trying to use the there we go. So this is actually doing a selected value of the display format from that table that I actually showed people just now. And so that'll then, depending on what I select in the slicer, that'll then just change the actual the option on the right hand side here. So in this column here is that this will change depending on what option I select in the slicer. So this is now going to be displayed in thousands. If I change it to billions, it'll get changed in billions. And the same thing happens in the chart as well, is that if I select billions, is that it'll change it to billions in the chart. If I change it to 1,000, it changes it to 1,000 in the actual chart itself. Now, one of the things to be very, very cautious of, and I'll point this out, is that what I have found is that with dynamic format strings is that if you don't set your display units to none and you leave it as auto, you get some very strange things happening on the y-axis. So the y-axis here is being displayed as 0BNK. So it does some very odd things in the actual y-axis as well as on the display labels. And it's something that I'm not sure why it actually does this. I suspect it's something within Power BI. It's a bug within Power BI. And so what you need to remember is to go in, change the y-axis under values, change them to none, and things work again. So just a cautionary tale on that side of things. Now, similar logic to this bottom one here is where I'm changing the decimal places. I've got a measure in here which is looking at income per donor, I've got a base measure that is also currency with 2 decimal places, but I've actually got another one here called income per donor that's referencing that original measure. But again, I've got dynamic formatting set up here. And so what this will do is that this references another table that I've built into the report here, which is actually, if I show people this other table here. So this particular table is looking at this one here, which has actually got different format strings depending on what the variations that I wanted to look at. I'll be getting into a lot of these other ones later on. So this one here has got certain...
Don't forget your Control Plus for the DAX.
Yeah, and so if we do this one, do that one here. So you've got a whole lot of different format strings built into here. So I built this all into the calculated table. So I can have an option here which I can use on the slicer. I've got how many digits each of that is going to be displaying. So is that 0 decimal digits, 1 or 2? Because I'll use this later on in the report. I've got a sort order. So this gets displayed in the right order. I've got then different format strings here. So I've set up a format string for number. I've set up a format string for currency. I've set up a format string for percentage. And I've also set up a format string here using icons themselves. So if you look at this last one here is where I've actually added in the different icons here. So going back to our numeric format strings, if the percentage is positive, it'll show an up arrow. If the percentage is negative, it'll show a down arrow. If it's 0, no change, it won't actually display any icon at all. So you can actually build these icons. You can actually copy those, paste those into a format string, and you can actually use those then to format your values within your report. So there's a whole lot of different permutations that you might want to use here, because there might be numbers. So you can use exactly the same slicer. You just might want to apply different format strings to different values within your actual report itself. So if I go back to here and I select my slicer on the left-hand side, is if I'm wanting to, I don't want to show any decimals. So my chart here now displays a whole number. Same with on the right-hand side here is that my income per donor is displayed as a, just close that up a bit. So this number here is displayed as a whole number, whereas the original number, as I said, was currency with 2 decimal places. And again, I could change this here. I could change this down to 2 decimal places, and it does it. Now, one of the things that I have done is that I have implemented this exact methodology for the number of decimal places in a production report that we've got. And I've applied this across about 100 of the 300 measures within the report. And they're all running against a fact table that's got about 75 million rows of data. And I've got no performance issues within that report, because one of the considerations that I've sort of pointed out later on is that when you are using dynamic format strings, you need to be a bit careful about performance of your measures. So that's one thing just to keep a wary eye on when you are doing it.
Yeah, UV asked that question. He said, "Does it?" He said his understanding was that it doesn't cause any performance degradation, as it applies on the calculated result of the measure.
It can do is that Marco did a really good video on it. And what happens when you use dynamic format string, the actual Vertipack, actually, you end up with 2 measures being created. One for the dynamic format string and one for the actual measure itself. So you could end up with a few performance issues, but like I say, I haven't ended up with any performance issues. I did some testing on our production report. Like I said, 100 odd measures that I've got this particular functionality applied to, and I've had no degradation, luckily. Then another alternative is if I'm wanting to do it at a measure-based option. So if I, for example, in some ways, I've got a slicer here as well. Again, going back to this whole thing of allowing the user to do changes within the report if they want. So in this situation here is that I've got the display units. So I've got an option here is that, do I want the, if you look at this top chart here, is that what you'll notice is that it's changing. So your values here at the top are 13.86 million. Then you've got your next row down, which is 2.81 billion. Then you've got other variants further down here that have been formatted as 20.67 thousand. So you've got different formats within that actual visual itself. Or you've got another situation where what happens if I want to fix it? So I've got the same format string being applied to all of the numbers in that visual, so it's less confusing for people. So I want to change it that I want to have everything as billions or everything as and this is where this particular measure is, that if I go into this particular one, same as before, I'm referencing exactly the same base measure, the total income USD, that's formatted as currency with 2 decimal places. However, if I jump now into the format option here, there's a bit more complexity built into it. So what I've done here is that depending on whether you have selected fixed or variable, so variable will just take the selected measure and it'll just do some calculations on it here. And so what it'll do is, depending on what the actual value is on that particular row of the visual, it'll determine whether it's in thousands or millions or billions. If it's fixed, what it'll do is that it'll look at what is the highest value within the context of that visual, and then it'll do the same format string to all the numbers within that actual visual itself. So, for example, here is that I know that if I go...
Antony, just a quick one. Anna said, is it possible to zoom up the report page by the view menu under page view and fit to window? If you click on view, because we've got quite a lot of white space around.
Yeah, I'll close that one up there.
And
that one, is that a bit better?
Yeah, and if you click on page view, at the top left, page view.
Yeah.
And drop down and fit to page, fit to window.
That might
work.
Break. That's fit to, I get fit to width and actual size. That's all I get.
Yeah.
So I can do fit to width because I'm using region to share. So that might be right.
Okay. Yeah. Okay.
But let me close up the things to see if there's a bit more. Is that a bit better?
Yeah, that's a bit better. Thank you.
So if I go back to just looking at the format string here, so like I said, is that it depends, it'll change depending on the context of the visual. So for example, if I go and select the continent of Africa, is that because my total is millions, is that everything will be displayed as millions. If I actually go and select Oceania, is that because I'm using that, is that it's going to be displayed as billions because my total is billions, because my total that I've got is billions, everything else reverts to billions because you've got an Australia one there that reverts to billions, and so that's the highest one, so that's what it'll revert to. Whereas in the African context, I can actually change that, and so it'll, depending on what my highest value is within that context. So that's how that sort of top one works. Then the bottom visual here is, I'm also using a sort of measure-based option here. So on this particular one here is I'm using the slicer on the left-hand side. Again, I was going back to this, we wanted to give the user the option to change things around. So if we go back to the dynamic format string here, is that within this option here, is that this becomes a lot more complex within the dynamic format string, because what I'm wanting it to do is that I'm wanting it to change. So I want the income to be formatted in a different way, depending on whether it's thousands, millions, or billions. I'm wanting to add in the up arrow or down arrow using the unichar characters here. And so that'll then change the percentage change side of things, as well as the option here of where I've got the display label that I've selected. So if I've selected income CY, please then only display the income. If I've selected the income percentage change, display the percentage change. If I've selected the third option, display the current value with a pipe symbol and the percentage change at the end of it. So you can do some pretty complex options within the actual format string. So you don't have to do just a plain selected value or just a very simple one. You can actually add a lot more complexity to this, and you can add in symbols, you can add in other variations. Now, one of the things that you have to be careful of, which is this here, is that because you are formatting things along the way, you need to add in these double quotes at the front end of it, because what will happen is Power BI, if you don't, is that if I didn't include those, it'll think that this is a text value, whereas by adding in the double quotes, it actually thinks it's what they call a literal string value. And so what will happen is that Power BI will actually go, oh, okay, so this is actually a number going into my charts, and so you can still actually do the formatting, the number formatting that you might want to do within the chart itself. So that's that one. Any questions on that page before I jump to the next?
Fernando's is where would you include Mexico, in North America or South America?
Well, it depends on Fernando, is that it depends on whether you're looking at it from a geographical context. So I've had this argument with, I work in the charity world, and a lot of organizations, depending on your nonprofit organization, some of them will put them into North America if you're looking at it as a geographical context, but a lot of nonprofits will actually put it into South America, or what they change it to call it Latin America, because it's often the case that they'll put them in depending on the sort of regional structures that they have within their organizations.
I love that answer. I thought he was just testing you, but that's a really genuine question. No, thank you. No, just a few questions about your screen, and I said I think it's because you've got an extra wide screen, because we see quite a bit of white around, and I think maybe, but we can see it much better now, and you're scrolling in with a DAX, so that's helping a lot as well. And okay. The content's brilliant.
Right. Now we go to another option here. So we've now looked at the sort of table-based options where you're just referencing the format string in a table. So quite simple. You've then got quite complex measures side of things. Now, this one here is sort of what I've just termed reference measure. Now, what I'm actually referring to here is where you may have a situation where I've got a slicer on the left-hand side here. I've got which I'll show just to give you a sense of what this actually is. So on this particular one, can you see that clearly, Sue? This one here?
Yeah, perfect. It's brilliant. Thank you.
So on this particular table, what I've got is another variation. So I've got the first option, which is what I've got on the slicer. The second format string is what I'm going to be using for formatting numbers. The other one, the third option, is what I use to format a display label as numbers, because I had a few issues with within the report. The third one is if I want to format the currency, so the currency on the y-axis, and the other option is if I want to format the currency within the display label side of things. So you might want to actually have a situation where your display label has got a different format string to the actual y-axis within your chart, which you can actually do if you're wanting to. So if I go back to the page here, so what I wanted to point out here is that I've got a situation here where if I take this first measure here, again, all the way references that original base measure that we've been using all the time. But what I'm doing in the dynamic format string here is that I'm using the selected value from this particular calculated table. So I'm using that, I'm using the selected value within the dynamic part of that measure itself. But also too, one of the important things to sort of try and remember if you are building these things is to include an alternate format string, because what may happen is that you may not have a slicer on your page, but you may want the alternate format string to be applied to that measure somewhere else within your report. But the other thing as well, what I'm also wanting to point out here is that this is using the selected value within the dynamic formatting of that individual measure itself. However, what happens, you might want to have the situation where you've got a measure itself across multiple different measures, and you can actually also reference another measure which has a format string to come into that measure. So for example, this particular measure itself, if I go back to this particular measure, is that this is very similar. All this is doing is also using the selected value from that particular table. But what you've got to remember is that this is only one place where I have to do any logic change. So I can now apply this measure and use this to dynamically format multiple other measures around the report. So for example, in our production report, I've got 3 measures. One measure that does absolute with 1 decimal place, one that does absolute with 2 decimal places, and a sort of decimal number with 1 decimal place. So I can then apply those 3 measures to the dynamic format strings across all the different measures within my report, knowing the sort of what I actually kind of want to display within all my charts, and everything will be reflected all the way through the actual report itself. Then, like I said, it's really useful to have that alternate format string, because in this situation, the bottom chart here is that I've removed the interaction with the slicer up at the top here. So the bottom chart here is going to always default to this alternate format string that I've actually got in place. So it's a good thing to build that into the actual report itself. Any questions, Sue, and then jump on to the next lot?
Jump on to the next lot, but I think people are blown away. There's lots of claps, lots of. I'm gobsmacked really by what you can do with these things. So yeah.
Right. Next one is.
You're at 15 minutes.
I know, that's what I'm worried about. So.
No, you can always come back, but it's absolutely brilliant.
Right. So if I now look at now, let's. So what I'm now wanting to do is think about, okay, we've covered off the dynamic formatting of the sort of the numbers themselves. Now let's add in the conditional formatting side of things. So on the left-hand side here is that I've got a chart, I've got a slicer here, which the top one here will just have standard colors within the charts. I've got an option here which will select no labels. So if I'm wanting to this is just changing all the different columns to gray, and it makes all the labels go transparent. Then I might have another option here which selects the highest and lowest values within the columns and the labels themselves. So in this middle chart here, I've got the lowest option here and I've got the highest one here. I might want to just only highlight the highest value within the chart. I might want to do just the lowest one. You may want to do the first and the last. Whatever option, I've built in quite a few options here. We might want to do odds and evens side of things, depending on what you're wanting to do on, say, for example, this one with the years. The other option that I've built in here is that if we wanted to see all the columns that are above the average value for that particular time period, this will do the columns. And I've got another slicer at the bottom here to say, for example, I want to see what the average line is. So please show me the average line in the visual. Or you can actually turn that off if you don't want it to be displayed. Another option that you could build into here as well is to say, can you show me the top N? So I've got this numeric range slicer at the bottom here to show me the top N number of records within this chart. So this chart here is going to show me the top 20 records within this chart, and I think there's about 40 countries in the middle chart here. So obviously, because I'm showing the top 20, the chart on the right hand side is going to display all the columns, because I've only got 2, 4, 6, 8, 9 columns here. So by default, it's going to show me all nine columns. Same with if I looked at the bottom 20, is that the middle chart will show me the bottom 20 countries based on income, and the right chart will still show me all 9 because there's only 9 in the chart itself. The other option that you might want to do is, which is what we've had to do, is that in our production reports is that you base it on a hex code. Now, what we've had to do within our production reports is that if we are visualizing, like I said, we work with a lot of charities around the world, and in one of our reports we build, we've got 17 different organizations within those charts. And as they prescribed to us that we had to color each of the columns for each of those organizations based on the color of that organization. And so that was their requirement. That was what we had to do. So we've got 17 different color ranges, a different color for each different organization. And so we can apply that based on particular rules. So in this situation, I've just selected a random set of colors for my different countries that I've got in the data here, and I'm just applying different colors for each of them. And then I've also created a measure that will apply a different hex code to each of the different years within this actual chart itself. So what I'm going to do is try and jump onto some of the other ones instead of getting into the sort of, I'll very briefly cover over the sort of what happens with each of these two charts. So what happens is that each of these two charts, they have both a label formatting measure as well as a column formatting measure. So if I go and open up the actual the column formatting by country, is so within the column formatting by country, depending.
Oh, that just sends dread into my soul.
Why? Well, that's, so within here is that depending on the options that you've selected, is that here, this will then do something different. And so at the bottom here, I've got a switch statement. Now, what I have done is that I use this in a lot of my reports, is that I actually have standard measures that I use. So I'll have a font color for blue, a font color for green, whatever you want. Yeah. So you might have a font color for positive, one for negative, whatever you might do. I also have a font color for transparent. So I can use these measures anywhere else within my report, and I can just update them whenever I need to.
I do that bit, but the whole
it's more
impressive.
Fun. So anyway, so there's a separate measure for the color formatting for the actual column, and then there's also very similar for the actual by country. So if you look at by country, you've got a very similar logic that's being applied, where you've got all various different options. So within the case here, so like I said earlier, if you select no labels, it'll change all your labels to go transparent. Because that's what I wanted it to actually do. So people can go through the PBEX and go and have fun and games when they actually look at this later on. So that's looking at the color formatting side of things. Any quick questions on those, Sue? Because I know we're running out of time.
We all think you're Italian, not South African.
Yeah, well, I am half Italian, so there we go. So so there we go.
And Christian said tablet editor, and he would try to C# script this. So my thing to you is, Christian, you do it, and then I can have it, please.
Yes, yeah, thanks, Christy. Yeah, that'll be great.
Yeah, thank you, Christian. And then Fernando's done a GIF with like.
Yeah, come on. Right, so let's go next level up, next stage up. So now we've got a situation now where we've done some conditional formatting. Now let's combine that with some dynamic format strings. So we've got this conditional formatting from earlier. We've now got quite a sort of just a basic one that I showed earlier, where there's some just basic format strings that have got whole numbers and thousands with various decimals, but it's not fully dynamic. So in this situation here, I can highlight the highest and lowest, but I can also change the numbers on the actual top of the thing. So if I want to display them in millions with 1 decimal, great. If I want to display them in billions with 2 decimals, then do the same thing. So depending on what I'm actually wanting to select, so I can combine the colors together with the actual formatting, the dynamic format strings that I'm actually wanting to add into the mix. So I can also change this to whole and be 2 decimal places if I'm wanting to. So the sort of final output, which is what we had earlier with the target page, is where we've now got it built into here, where we've now got a slicer on the left-hand side that controls the label and column formatting. We've got a slicer at the top here that controls whether the numbers are going to be in thousands, millions, or billions. An option here that controls the number of decimal places. The option here which shows or doesn't show the average line. And we've also got an option here to control what is displayed on the display label as well. So for example, here is that I might say, I don't want to display any labels. I might want to show the income. I might want to show the income and the percentage change on that visual. I might want to actually show the number of donors, which is a completely separate measure that I can reference. So the baseline of this report is showing income, but I'm actually showing the number of donors at the top of the columns. And again, I could then change this. So do I want to see my donor counts in thousands? I might actually want to see my donor counts in the actual whole numbers, but I actually don't want to do that for the income because the income is quite large. I'd rather change the income to only show that in millions because that makes more sense side of things potentially. The other option is that I might want to change it to a completely separate sort of measure that's looking at average income per donor. And again, might want to change that down to decimal, change the number of decimal places within that particular measure itself. You may even want to do it where you might actually want to display the x-axis above a column, whatever you're wanting to actually do. Now, within this actual page itself is that there is a lot of complexity built into this particular chart itself. And I will say is that this chart is built on the top of 5 different calculated tables here. The chart on the right-hand side here is built on the top of 6 different measures within here, because each of the, for example, within here is that I'm actually using a measure that controls the color of the columns. I've also then got a separate measure here that actually controls the separate measure here that controls the number that is actually displayed at the top of the column. A separate measure that controls the color of that particular the value label, as well as the actual detail label, because this is where you can actually add in 3 different levels of hierarchy on top of a column, is where you can add in a title, you could do a value, and you can do a detail. So that's how I've stacked this. I've used the value option as well as the detail. So this is why you can end up with an income as well as a percentage change underneath each other side of things. So there's quite a lot of complexity built into it, into this particular visual itself. So I know we only got 5 minutes, Sue, so I'm going to try to jump onto the next one very quickly, unless any questions.
No, but yeah, carry on. 5 minutes.
Cool. All right then.
Oh yeah, Paul said actually. Paul said he takes it that you have these controls on a starting page, but I think you'll probably want to cover that with your final slide.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
So if I just jump onto a new feature that's just come out last week, is the visual level format strings. So what happens with these? They've brought this functionality in mainly to apply to visual calculations, but you can actually apply it for measures and columns as well. So what happens is that you've got these format strings that you can actually apply at what we call an element level. So say, for example, your display label, down to your visual, so that'll be your chart, and then down to your model level, so that'll be your income USD that we've been using all the way along. So if, for example, and so what happens is that the format string used for the element takes precedence over the visual, takes precedence over the model. And so that's how it actually, the idea behind these formats work. So for example, if I show people on this one very briefly, is that in the actual, I've got a measure built in here, which is looking at total income USD. Now, what I've got here is that I've actually, let me just go back to, I've got them all highlighted. So each of the actual cards have actually got the format strings that I've actually used. So in this first card, I formatted the actual custom format of the measure in the model to be hash, comma, hash, hash, 0.00. So it's just a plain number with 2 decimal places. The data format is set to auto and the display units is set to auto. So what will happen is the auto will override the everything else underneath it, and so you get this 19.86 billion being displayed. In card 2, I've got the same format string on the model level. The data format is set to auto, but the display units are set to none, and so I end up with this number that's actually got the two decimal points as it is down in the model level. Then the third card, I've got same at the model level, but I've changed the data format to be dollars and hash. I've got rid of the decimal points. So within this particular one here, on this particular card itself, under the general, there's a data format option. And under here, I've actually set the actual data format. Normally it's set to auto, and I've set the format there to be this, because this is what I want to display on that particular visual itself. So, and the display units is none, so it displays this according to the data format, which is the level down from the display units. In the fourth option here, I've actually got a slicer that's controlling the actual formatting of the display units. So in this instance, I can actually change this one here, and so it'll actually display the number in millions with 1 decimal place, because that's what I asked for. Or I can display it in billions if I'm wanting it to, or I can display it in the thousands with 1 decimal point. So you can see is that, various, depending on what you set these different data formats on, you can have a multitude of different options on the same page itself. If I now, any questions on that, Sue, because I know we're almost out of time.
No.
Cool. Now, one of the things that people do need to be careful of, that when you do set up these measures, the dynamic format strings, they may be very restrictive to particular reports, visuals that you may want to do, so they may not be relevant in other places. You may have the situation as well where you end up with data model bloat. As you've seen, there's quite a few measures that you end up creating along the way to create these things. As I mentioned earlier, performance may be an issue. As I mentioned earlier, be careful of any custom format strings, that particularly things that are like currencies or things where you're including a dot in them, be that at the before the number or even after the number. So for example, if I put in K or a dot for Danish kroner at the front of the format string, I ended up with some very weird results coming out. I also end up with a situation where sometimes the visuals don't display the values correctly. So generally try and change the display units from auto to none. Generally that then will solve that problem. And then the other
I wish they would do that as a default, that it defaulted to none.
Yeah.
That would be, it's like the, image fit, when it fitted, just that little thing, if it would just default to none, I have to go in every time and say none, don't summarize it. Don't put a default, Yeah, I know you can, Fernando. But why? But why? Just
why,
do it for
Fernando?
me.
Why?
Why? Date, small format.
Yeah.
Really, these little things like this would make my life so much better.
All of our lives easier.
Go on, then you're nearly done. I'll stop.
There we go. Right. So I will part with a statement at the bottom. Just because we can does not necessarily mean we should. Every report is different, and so giving the end user as much flexibility may not be what needed or even wanted, or even actually takes too much time to actually build in all this flexibility and functionality. But like I said, I've built in the option where we've got an option to change the decimal places for loads of measures in our production report, and I've also built in the functionality to show labels or don't show labels. on every single page of our reports. So it actually didn't take me very long to actually do that if you've got very simple things to set up. So that's the key takeaways. But obviously it gives you the functionality gives you ideas to do things. And then just two useful links is the desktop custom format strings and the format function DAX link. That gives a loads of extra stuff in terms of how to format things like dates and time, which could be very useful. And then again, just my LinkedIn link at the bottom and the GitHub link as well. And there's also, to let you know, there's a couple of bonus pages in the PBEX, one which is looking at currency conversion and another one that's looking at locale formatting. I ran out of time. I didn't get to do those, which I was hoping to do, but they'll be part of the PBEX, so you can play around with those and have a look at them. So
yeah, and you can always come back. You can come back. There's just so many positives saying thank you, UV, thank you for the session, and from Christian and Paul and Nigel and Takimi, lots and lots of gratitude and thanks, because I know how much time you have spent on this. It's, you know, I've blown away by it, Antony, because I'm, you know, my visual level is usually quite simple, and I go to Tableau Editor for everything, like click 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 click. But you know, the thing that for me simple, the Takimi's a bit blown away because she's like, it's so much to learn and just and I said, just take one or two things away and then remember who did it, and then you can look it up. So I like, you know, the third thing, I've always wondered why there's a third formatting option. I'd forgotten it was for a 0. So, you know, and sometimes you just take away one or two small snippets, and I use the measures for the colors. I love that, but I'm definitely going to have a play with this because this is brilliant. Any last questions for everyone? You've got a couple of minutes if you want to unmute. Brilliant. And Shiva said that was an amazing session that they will review again, and then now they've got answers to different requests from stakeholders. And I think
good.
I think that's it, isn't it? You wouldn't necessarily have all of those, but you would pick one or two that you could use.
Yeah. Well, that's the whole idea, is to yes, I went to the houses on that page, but that's the whole idea, is to add a load of complexity to something to go show what's possible, and then just take the bits that you think are relevant to yourself.
And Takimi said, one question from Takimi, and then we'll call it quits. She said she wants to know how easy it was for the top and bottom end slicer. Do you want to show the DAX for that?
Yeah, I'll show the DAX one.
There's a really nice thing by SQL BI where they go through.
The top end one.
I'll ask. And whilst you're finding that, Julie pointed out, which I asked but I forgot to ask properly, was, do you have access to Takimi at the front, which Paul said, you know, if your users click on, do you ask them as a front page what their preferred, you know, what their preferences are? Do you want to see data labels, what currency, what this, what that? So you have a front page where your users put their selections in, and that's the default throughout the report.
You could do that if you're wanting to. The thing that I've found, what I've tended to do on our production reports, is that I've put that into the filter pane. So because then it's a lot easier, and then I don't have to be having syncing slices through all my different pages. And also too, there are also pages that we've had situations where there's some pages I don't want people to have the ability to do any changes on those pages for particular reasons.
Yeah.
So I've generally built the slices into the filter pane. So I've added the slices in on at a page level option. But then I've always done that, and I've always set them to sort of certain defaults. So my filter pane will always change color. I've always set it up so my filter pane will change color for any applied cards, and I'll always leave a filter pane open on our production reports so people can see that, okay, so that's been applied on this particular page, and also to set them to single select as well within the filter pane.
Brilliant.
That's what I do on our production reports. On the max and min side of things, is what you've got is that you've got a selected axis. So I'm doing a calculate table on all the values and on all selected. And then the highest value is just doing a max X on that selected axis based on the total income. And lowest value is just looking at the min X on that particular one. Very simple, well, relatively simple. And then you use those measures later on in the switch statement. So in the switch statement down here is that if you selected the highest and lowest, and the total income equals the highest value, then I change the font color to green. If I've selected the highest and lowest and the total income equals lowest value, then change the font color to red. If it's highest and the total income equals the highest value, then do green, or the other option where you're selecting just lowest, then do the similar logic. So you sort of set those further up in the variables and then use them further down within the switch statement to decide which ones you're actually wanting to display. And you've got the same logic gets applied to the label formatting as well as the column formatting.
Yeah, perfect. They want to see your GitHub again.
The GitHub is, there we go. Do you want to put that in the chat, Sue?
Yes, please. Have you got it? Can you?
Yeah, I'll just, my chat's not working properly for some reason. I've not seen any of it, but I'll try. Let's see what happens. Yeah. Now I can see all the chat after the end.
Yeah.
Not working here, Sue, unfortunately.
Okay.
Do you want to just type it in and then?
You can type it in. GitHub Antony Catella resources.
There we go.
You write it in. But it's brilliant because it's
fun.
Really generous of you to put this in your GitHub. I was just saying Kane did the same when he first went through, when he first did field parameters and calculation groups. And I think I went through his presentation, his report, about 3 or 4 times just to understand how it all worked. And then you've got it there, haven't you? But like you say, you want to, you know, but don't pressurize yourself, Takimi. You're doing amazingly well. And, you know, it takes time, and just remember where things are. And then when you need it, you know, but don't, you know, Antony's spent years getting this knowledge and then putting it all together. So, you know, be kind to yourself, Takimi. That's my yoga teaching. Be kind to yourself. Yeah,
exactly. Be kind, because you know, it takes a while, and it's taken many hours and days, weeks of you know, learning stuff along the way, and I think that's the case with all of us.
Yeah. So don't, you know, don't beat yourself up. Be nice.
Yeah, exactly. So
yeah. On that happy note from the yoga universe that is Sue, be kind to yourselves.
There we go.
Thank you, Antony. That was absolutely brilliant. And what I loved as well was the way that everyone came behind you and said, "Oh, I'll try doing Control and Shift." And Anna was saying about the PBI report. So there's a lot of really, really positive behind you. What's coming up, Julie? Bear with me. We have, let me share with you. I'm just gonna share my screen. Thank you, Antony. But that was brilliant. So what we have coming up, there's some more fabulous things coming up. If you go onto the page and look on events, we've just had Antony. We've got Jakob. Jakob works for Microsoft Excel and has done for over 20 years. And he's created an add-in called List Slicer, but he's also going to show us some other funky things about Excel. And he's also a fellow marathon runner, so he's really cool. And it's just, I've sort of had a bit of a demo with him, and he was showing me some of the stuff in Excel, and it was just such a joy to have someone just showing you who works, you know, a bit of a hero worship, really. And then we've got Paul Pennant, who's going to take us through SharePoint, because I don't know about you, but I'm spending more and more time in SharePoint, and it would be really nice just to understand a bit more of the functionality about it. And then we have our very own Fernando talking to us about data flows Gen 2, which I love data flows. So I'm looking forward to that. And then on the 24th, we've got Alex Bideau. And I don't know if you've heard of Alex, but he was very, very well recognized within Enterprise DNA, and he does the most amazing visual presentations. He's awesome. So he's going to do something for us. I've got a couple of slots free end of September and then in October. But then I've got Bernat, and Bernat is he's a tablet editor genius. So it will be mind-blowing and awesome, and we will need to make sure we have coffee before that. And then I've got Christian and Bogdan, who are going to be talking about Power BI and Power Apps, which is also something I'm really keen to learn about. And then we've got a date for Python Sempian Fabric with Christina. I keep saying Christiana. And Brian's coming back to do some more real-time intelligence. So I've got a few more slots to slot in, but I'm thinking I might do one on Fabric for small businesses and take you through it a step at a time, from how to set up an F2 and how to get the a whole thing, and then maybe add a little bit of Python in. So I'm thinking of throwing that in for you to do something instead of just take, although I do present elsewhere, but just take. Anyway, but anyone that is interested, I know I'm going to go, I've just seen the clock, Christian, thank you. Anyone that is interested in presenting, yeah, Takimi, you could present on your learning journey, or we can just have a fun share session. I'm open for everything, but it doesn't always have to be, it's your group and I'm just facilitating it. So if you've got something you want to practice, or you want to have a go at, or you want to do it as a group or whatever, please just reach out to me on LinkedIn and share your ideas and visions. I know we've got some really intelligent people and passionate people in the group. So anytime you want to have an opportunity to present, please do so, because this is what it's here for, to enable you to grow. Anyway, with that in mind, I'm going to yoga. Yay. Thank you, Antony. Thank you.
Worries. Pleasure,
but please,
pleasure.
Anyone that wants to have a practice, I'd take time with you beforehand, have a practice run through. Do let me know. And have a great rest of the day, everyone. Goodbye from Albuquerque, Darren. I love that name. And thank you so much, Antony. And take care, everyone.
Pleasure.
Bye-bye.
Cool.
Bye.
Cheers then.
Bye.
Right. Bye.
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 Bye. I'll stop recording now. Stop. Okay. Bye-bye all. Take care.